After I work on my thumbnails, I really like to do a color swatch. So I'm looking at all these colors in nature that are the green of the grass and the kind of interesting background mixture of grays and sort of purpley grays and sky, the brightness of the sky and the darkness of the trees and all that. And I have my palette out, and I just want to see what each color does. What is the range that I get to work with today? And I warm up a little bit by just taking each color on my palette and adding a bit to my paper, and then adding in a bit of white. And this just in and of itself gives me a range within each color toward its lightest aspect, and mixing a couple of colors together to create a secondary color, perhaps blue with yellow to make a green, especially when you're doing landscape. You have lots of different kinds of greens that you're going to want to be exploring, and that gives you kind of a nice way to begin. And then I go right on into creating a value study based on one of my thumbnails that expresses not anything really to do with color, but rather just the light, dark, and mid values of the scene. And I block this in very quickly. This is, again, it's another way of warming up. It's another way of just perceiving the differences between the values, the lights and the darks and the mid-range, the mid grays of the landscape. And what I find fascinating about doing this is that every time I do this, I start by feeling really confused about where is the light, where is the dark? And as I go through the process of creating the study, I begin to see. And in seeing those shifts of light and dark and mid-value, I feel like really my eyes have been opened and I'm ready to do the painting. And then a second or third process before actually jumping onto my canvas or my quote-unquote real painting is what I call just a color study or a field study. And you can see that I've taken the same composition, the vertical close-up of the barn, and I've reestablished a grid on it, breaking my composition into thirds horizontally and thirds vertically. And I'm really paying attention as I reestablish my subject that I'm putting my focal point, which is the barn and the roof of the barn, on one of those cross sections, the section of the painting which is the first horizontal line intersecting with the second vertical line. And that point is going to be, one of those places we naturally are drawn to looking in a composition. There are 4 separate spots in that grid that I'm touching on in this painting, and that's just an underlying grid to help me with placement of my objects while I work on this tonal beginning, and then pulling in the color, the actual local color. I'm working with fairly thin paint to start, beginning with that reestablishing of the drawing and the shadow side of the barn. And now I'm going in and creating a color that expresses the actual color that is out there for me to look at. And I'm using yellow ochre here in this particular instance, and but focusing on these 2 ideas of color and value, and moving really quickly. I would rather get it wrong, but get all that white knocked out of the painting, and then go back and correct. You really can't edit something or correct something unless you've actually done something. So be prepared to make mistakes and say, oh, that's not quite right. But make the mistake anyway, even if you know that it isn't 100% there. And then go back in and change it. It's just paint. So what I'm doing is really giving myself permission to make a stab at it, and that's what I want you to do, is just make a stab at getting it right. Let something stand, go back to it. You have the whole process of this study in which to kind of circle around the subject, the barn, the trees, the sky, the field, and make adaptations as you go along. So that's my process with this. I like to do a little color study to warm up, and I also like to do it because if I do a studio painting based on this barn later on, this little color study is going to give me a lot of fresh information that is going to be really instructive when I go back into a studio environment where I may not have in front of me the information of the actual subject that I'm painting. Memory is a wonderful tool. It helps you simplify and just let those things that are salient impressions rise up. And a little painting like this can give you a very fresh and immediate quality of perception that will inform later paintings. Some artists use a lot of photography in their work, and I do use photographs as guides, usually to get the values right or to correct values. One thing I noticed with this painting was that my understanding of the value, the relative darkness of the shadow side of that barn compared to the background tree form changed as I went along. First beginning with the thought that that was quite dark compared to the background, and then as I continued on my practice of creating thumbnails and tonal studies and finally this color painting, realizing that in fact that grayed, darker side of the barn, that shadow side of the barn, was a lighter value, and the space directly behind it was darker, which really took me the full hour of preparing and going through these processes to perceive. And when I go back into, say, working from this in the studio to create a piece that is derived from this type of sketch and such, a photograph of the scene is often a nice reference just to see how the camera picked up that value along with the sketch and the color sketch. And I don't want to overwork it. This isn't the final painting. This is just to give me those broad ideas, those broad color stories. And I'm adding in a few details of little notes of detail, the post and the windows, and lightening in areas where there's more dimensionality in the tree shapes, and cooling off some of the greens that were a bit warm, creating a contrast with that very warm green in the foreground lawn shape or pasture shape, and being prepared kind of at any minute in this to say enough is enough. There is a kind of desire to get it to a certain place of finish and then step away.